Since its founding in 2016, TikTok has been rapidly expanding and spreading its Macarena-like dances all over the globe, taking over social media. Working at such a fast-growing tech company must be pretty great, right? Well, you're about to find out because TikTok wants you. High salaries, opportunities for growth, and a highly recognizable company right there on your resume for future job applications. What could go wrong? Well, the truth might not be all that rosy after all. In fact, TikTok might just be one of the worst places in the world to work. Think we're exaggerating? Let's take a look at what working at TikTok is really like, starting with the most common and insane complaint of former employees. Number 10. The 996 work culture. There are plenty of rumors online about China's 996 work culture, meaning working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, making its way over to TikTok's offices in the US. After all, the company is headquartered in China, meaning that it operates in some ways that are distinctly Chinese. But more on that later. According to former employees, including ex-lead product manager Melody Chu, not only are the insane work hours accurate, they can actually be even worse. Because the US TikTok team works with China's employees, evenings frequently consist of back-to-back meetings and work calls with their Chinese colleagues. Melody herself explains that her social life on weekdays was non-existent. According to her, I work over 60 hours a week. Over half of my team sits in China, so my meetings with China teammates start at 6 p.m. and end at 10 p.m., sometimes later. Perhaps if you're single, an introvert, and live alone, that doesn't sound like the worst thing ever, but let's face it, even single people need free time. But the problems compound exponentially if you're in a relationship, or have kids, or, a life. According to Melody, she missed almost every dinner with her husband because her job demanded that she be in meetings with Chinese coworkers all evening. Her marriage suffered immensely, sending both her and her husband to therapy. She seldom saw her parents even though they lived in the same town. The opportunity to work at TikTok might sound appealing for young techies starting in the industry. They can just power through for a few years and take the money and experience before moving to a job with more normal working hours. But prospective employees have to seriously think about how working over 60 to 65 hours a week will impact every relationship in their lives. Even a couple of years of constantly working and buried in a laptop is enough to ruin most relationships and do a number on your mental health. Some employees had even more horrific stories than Melody's, estimating that they averaged 85 hours of meetings per week. To give you an idea of how insane that is, if you're getting your recommended 8 hours of sleep a night, that means you spend more time in meetings than sleeping, as 8 times 7 equals only 56 hours of sleep. One woman had to attend so many back-to-back meetings without a break, she had no time to change her sanitary protection. Something that women inform us usually takes a grand total of 30 seconds to a minute. That being said, many young workers in Silicon Valley have become accustomed to crazy hours, and let's face it, TikTok has some of the craziest. So this might not seem so shocking, especially when you're making bank. Maybe those evening meetings and endless hours are all worth it to get a stupendous amount of money at the end of the day. Well, not if a fair chunk of that money won't be worth anything. Number 9. Your salary may not be what it seems. TikTok employees, like most corporate employees, get salaries and bonuses that are on the high side. The median salary for a software engineer at ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, is $213,000. Even in Silicon Valley, that's a fair amount of cash. But a lot of the great bonuses advertised for prospective employees come from something called Vested Restricted Stock Units, or RSUs. This isn't exactly your normal stock option, as ByteDance has not been listed publicly on the stock exchange for many reasons we'll get to in a bit. However, they basically amount to a guarantee of future equity in the company. Future equity in a fast-growing company might sound like a great bonus, but there is a bit of a problem with this. TikTok's future is a little uncertain, with big markets like the US discussing bans. This means the RSUs of a current US TikTok employee would plummet in value pretty quickly. Even if a ban doesn't occur, the nature of the very volatile tech industry, combined with the unpredictable nature of social media apps, means that the future of TikTok is always up in the air. Think of how quickly X's valuation and user base has gone down the drain since a certain South African billionaire took over. And if that's not enough to discourage you from applying, here's another problem. Number 8. Chinese management styles can cause a lot of problems. ByteDance's headquarters are in China, with offices operating out of Singapore, but generally all major decisions come down from the Chinese team. While TikTok has a huge presence in Silicon Valley, the US office is very much subordinate to the Chinese directors. This also means that managerial styles are mostly Chinese, with very little influence from Silicon Valley work culture. For someone who has only lived and worked in the US, this can lead to a whole host of problems. Chinese managerial styles tend to prioritize speed of work above all else, unfortunately usually including work-life balance and the mental health of their employees. To incentivize incredibly rapid modes of working and development, one of the major management tactics used is splitting up workers into teams and forcing them to compete, sort of like a tech industry version of the Hunger Games. This may sound effective, but it actually creates a whole host of problems, chief of which is inefficiency. Let's go back to Melody Chu. She described various times where she and her team had been working on a new product for TikTok, only to discover that another team, either in the same office or in China, has also been working on something very similar. So essentially, teams were sometimes overlapping on the same exact projects instead of dividing it up between various employees. And that's because the directive from TikTok's management was to build separately for now and will integrate sometime in the future. However, teams had no clear guidance on how anything would be integrated or even when these new products would be expected. And due to a lack of transparency and the spirit of intense competition, no one had any idea how fast the other team was working. All the team leaders knew was that their team had to win. And to win, they had to work faster and better than the other team. This created a completely paranoid working culture where teams would constantly feel like their coworkers were forging ahead, withholding helpful information, and generally untrustworthy. Not the most collaborative environment imaginable, which leads us nicely to our next entry. Number 7. You won't be able to get information you need. One of the other problems with the work culture at TikTok is a relative lack of transparency. Employees, even high-ranking ones in the US office, don't always have access to all the information they need in order to do their job. Leaders at Chinese headquarters would tend to keep critical information and strategies pretty close to their chest, leaving workers wondering what exactly they were working toward. Sometimes employees couldn't even access basics about their own company. TikTok's organizational charts are obscured in company files, and pretty much all documents are locked up by default. This creates an incredibly frustrating company culture for employees trying to find or even double-check basic company data. We don't want to paint a picture of China's TikTok headquarters as a super secretive and shadowy organization that refuses to work with their US counterparts. A big chunk of the problem comes down to cultural differences, the most prominent of which is the language barrier. Number 6. Mandarin speakers preferred. Part of the problem with TikTok's Chinese headquarters sharing information with their US teams is that most important documents are in Mandarin Chinese. As you can imagine, for English speakers on the west coast of the United States, this causes more than a bit of a problem. And honestly, the process of translating hundreds and thousands of pages of documents and research into English from Mandarin every time a project needs to happen is incredibly frustrating and time-consuming, which is why sometimes the Chinese teams just opt for not doing it. And to be fair, neither does the American team. Since TikTok's US office is essentially a satellite office of the company's Chinese headquarters, the vast majority of the documents that require translation and the people who are heading up the company are Chinese. This also creates a major unspoken criteria when it comes to hiring and promotions. Non-Chinese Americans do work at TikTok, of course, but being able to speak some level of Mandarin usually counts a lot for prospective employees. This also impacts the chances of career progression in the company, with Mandarin speakers being promoted faster than non-speakers. Essentially, if you don't speak Mandarin, a bright future at TikTok might not be in the cards for you. This also means that often important discussions happening in TikTok's Chinese headquarters end up excluding a lot of US employees who could probably benefit from listening to them. So if you don't speak Mandarin, you won't be invited to the party, except in this case, the party is a meeting concerning decisions that will immediately affect your work environment and the future of your career, which takes us neatly to the next issue. Number 5. Miscommunications abound. Even worse, when people actually bother to translate information, it actually creates more problems than it solves. Former employees have stated that miscommunication ran rampant. English and Mandarin Chinese are worlds apart. In fact, they are rated as one of the hardest languages for speakers of the other to learn, even if you're maintaining your daily streak on Duolingo. This can lead to a lot of lost in translation moments, especially when the person translating documents isn't exactly fluent in the original language. One employee placed the language comprehension rate at 75% accuracy on both sides when it came to workplace misunderstandings, which is better than a coin toss, but not great when the translation you need to understand involves your work project for the next 3 months. All these differences in language and work culture create an unfathomably challenging environment, but also resentment and distrust on both sides, meaning US and Chinese employees that should be teammates and co-workers sometimes tend not to work well together. Number 4. teamwork is incredibly challenging. Due to the fact that the two countries are located almost in polar opposite time zones, they also only have 4 hours a day to even attempt collaboration. This might not sound like that much of a problem until you realize that no US TikTok product teams operate independently from Chinese headquarters. This requires constant communication and collaboration between the teams. Ex-employees have mentioned that they were given a fair amount of responsibilities and learned a lot during their time at TikTok, but there is a reliance on Chinese leads controlling the project. The Chinese teams won't let go of good projects, and whenever one moves to the US, a tech lead from China will quickly follow. As you can imagine, this further breaks down the relationships between the Chinese and American teams working at ByteDance. And that brings us to another big problem when working for TikTok. Number 3. Your job is dependent on geopolitics. Funnily enough, the lack of trust and occasional resentment between TikTok's US and Chinese employees mirrors the lack of trust between the countries they reside in. Your job may be completely upended by your country's politics. And by your country, we're not just talking about China or the US, we're talking about both. Whenever the US-China geopolitical relationship hits a rough patch, workers at TikTok and ByteDance are often left in the lurch, worried about their future and the future of the company itself. For the last few years, US politicians have proposed bans on TikTok, which are being seriously considered more and more. In 2024, there will be challenges to a proposed TikTok ban in the US heard in court, which may determine the outcome of the company within the country. Obviously, banning the social media app in one of its biggest markets would be a crushing blow to TikTok, and it would probably result in a number of layoffs, most obviously of all in its Silicon Valley branch. If the US banned American citizens from using the app, it seems unlikely TikTok would be okay with American citizens working for the app. Meanwhile, Chinese authorities have started to clamp down on a lot of publicly listed US tech companies. This also allows them to suppress spread of information amongst their own citizens, who live in a mostly government-controlled environment. This makes it even more unlikely that ByteDance will ever be listed on the US stock exchange. This might seem like a lot of geopolitical posturing, but it has very real consequences for people working at TikTok. And even when those bans and crackdowns remain political talking points, the strained relationship between the US and China creates a lot of anxiety for those working at the company. Imagine pouring 12 hours a day, minimum 6 days a week, into your career and the company you work for, only to have that tossed aside because of political rivalries. It just adds an extra layer of stress to an already challenging job. And that brings us to one of the most controversial and most ethically problematic issues about working for TikTok. Number 2. Your company may be spying on you. According to Australian cybersecurity firm Internet 2.0, TikTok requests access to an enormous amount of phone data. CEO Robert Potter said the permission layer that the phone was requesting was significantly more than what they said they were doing publicly. When the app is in use, it has the ability to scan the entire hard drive, access the contact lists, as well as see all other apps that have been installed on the device. You might be thinking, doesn't every social media app do that at this point? If you want to buy a t-shirt online, you end up having to create an account, agree to the terms and conditions you've never read, and sign up for a newsletter that will annoy you on a weekly basis until you can be bothered to unsubscribe. Even visiting a local news site means giving your browser permission to track a hell of a lot of your online and phone activity. In today's online world, we have given up a lot of our rights to privacy, especially data privacy, which makes it even more concerning that coders and developers without any particular political bias are signaling out TikTok as an outlier in the sheer amount of information it gets from users. Not only that, but a lot of built-in data protections that phones and various servers now provide are bypassed by TikTok. Android users learned to their horror that TikTok was overriding their phone's built-in protections to collect their MAC addresses, which essentially shows the user's physical location. Of course, the fact that TikTok is fully owned by not just a foreign company, but a company that operates within a country that frequently finds itself at odds with the US government is even more concerning. At this point, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with TikTok's employees, especially their US ones? After all, they're not the ones directly, personally requesting the data from the average user. Well, for a lot of people, it creates an ethical conundrum and one employees seriously have to consider. There have been a lot of allegations, which are not entirely unfounded, that China is using TikTok to not only gather obscene amounts of data on US citizens, which brings us to the final and perhaps most disturbing aspect of working at TikTok. Number 1. You're probably enabling Chinese propaganda. In 2017, China passed an intelligence law that says it can force ByteDance to give it any information on US citizens that Chinese intelligence operations request. It was found that a lot of the videos promoted by the TikTok algorithm tended to favor the Chinese view of global events, even if that included rampant misinformation. The app's own ad library found that Chinese propaganda ads had been pushed to millions of people in Europe. These ads were not only related to Chinese Communist Party or CCP talking points, but also to the foreign interests of the party. Propaganda happens on all sides, but it is concerning that a deeply undemocratic nation like China, a country that highly represses its own people, now has free access to so much information on US users, especially the American youth. It provides a way to manipulate users that the Chinese viewpoint is the correct one, enabling political audiences to fall in line with Chinese stances on various international issues, including geopolitical ones. We are already having a lot of trouble distinguishing objective, factual data from misinformation on the internet. So adding another method to spread disinformation for a country that actively operates against the US is something to be concerned about. And if you're working for TikTok as a US citizen, it's something you might want to be concerned about as well. At the end of the day, it seems like even though TikTok may offer a great learning opportunity for developers and seemingly great compensation package, the downsides of the company lead to a lot of people fleeing the company sooner or later, and even flat out turning down job offers. So, if you have an offer, maybe think twice about it. Now that you heard former employees' stories about working at TikTok, perhaps check out other horror stories from around the world, like the ones found in this video here or this other video.